My fellow citizens of the world,
the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Saffron-robed men on street corners, dancing and chanting with cymbals and drums. Bedraggled young people running from car to car, selling flowers in the pouring rain. Glassy-eyed men and women confronting people behind folding tables near busy intersections, asking for money to quarantine AIDS victims and build particle beam weapons. Over 900 people, men, women, and children, lying dead, face down in the mud. Mention cults to someone and these might be some of the images you'll evoke. Yet these images do not accurately represent cults, mind control, and undue influence as they exist today. They represent only a small fraction of these phenomena. Imagine a different set of images then. Business executives in three-piece suits sitting in hotel ballrooms for company-sponsored awareness training, not permitted to stand up or leave, even to go to the bathroom. Housewives attending psych up rallies so they can recruit friends and neighbors into a multi-level marketing organization. Hundreds of students gathering at an accredited university, being told they can levitate and fly through the air if only they meditate hard enough. High school students practicing satanic rituals involving blood and urine, being directed by an older leader who claims he will help them develop their personal power. Troubled teens being sent off to boot camps by their deceived parents, unregulated by the government, some run by religious groups who seek to convert them. Hundreds of women and men of every description paying huge sums to learn cosmic truths from some channeled spirit. Tens of thousands of women dressed in long dresses, living in harem-type households run by men with long beards. Young girls and women, and men and boys as well, being sold for sex, making their traffickers rich. Young Muslims being trained to kill, rape, and even blow themselves up in the name of Allah. These are some of the forms that mind control takes today. Do you know anyone who has undergone or witnessed a radical personality change because of belonging to such a group? The odds are that you do. Someone you know, someone in your family, at work, or in your circle of friends has likely been directly and profoundly affected by undue influence. In the past decades, the destructive cult phenomenon has mushroomed into a problem of tremendous social and political importance. It is estimated that there are now over 3,000 destructive cults in the United States, directly affecting more than 3 million people. These organizations come in many different types and sizes. Some have hundreds of millions of dollars. Others are relatively poor. Some, however, are clearly more dangerous than others. The largest and most destructive are not content to simply exercise their control over the lives of their members. They have an agenda to gain political power and use it to reshape American society or even the entire world. Considering how well these cults have been largely able to shield themselves from public scrutiny, it might seem alarmist to regard them as a threat to individual liberty and society as a whole. Yet some are influencing the political landscape through extensive lobbying efforts and electioneering for candidates. Some are attempting to influence United States foreign policy by lobbying covertly for foreign powers. The Moonies, for example, were a major supplier of money and guns to the Contra forces in Nicaragua. They also invested between 70 and 100 million in Uruguay, in a failed attempt to turn that country into the cult's first theocratic state, a springboard from which to pursue its declared goal, which is to conquer and subjugate the world." End quote. In the United States, cults exert tremendous economic clout by buying up huge blocks of real estate and taking over hundreds of businesses. Some enter corporations under the pretense of offering executive leadership training while harboring a covert agenda of taking over the company. Some seek to influence the judicial system by spending millions of dollars annually on top of attorneys to bend the law to their will. Since all destructive cults believe that their ends justify any means, no matter how harmful, they typically believe themselves to be above the law. As long as they believe that what they're doing is right and just, many of them feel justified to lie, steal, cheat, or to use any and all forms of undue influence to accomplish their ends. They routinely violate, in the most profound and fundamental way, the civil and religious liberties of the people they recruit. They turn unsuspecting people into slaves. When I call a cult destructive, I do so because it meets the specific criteria described in detail that I will discuss later. When I call a cult destructive, I do so because it meets the specific criteria that I will describe later. Briefly, a destructive cult is a group that violates its members' rights and damages them through the abusive techniques of unethical mind control. It distinguishes itself from a normal, healthy social or religious group by subjecting its members to systematic control of behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions, to keep them dependent and obedient. When domestic abuse survivors hear this definition, they often describe their relationship with their abuser as a cult with one follower and one leader. A pimp with 4 women or men under his control forms a cult of 5. A sweatshop of foreign workers who have been economically lured there and who now cannot leave is a labor trafficking cult. A multi-level marketing business that makes its money from selling products to buyers, but by misleading and recruiting even more sales associates, is a marketing cult. A corporation that demands obedience and unpaid overtime from its workers and forces them into motivational training sessions that are in fact mind control is a business cult. Methods of operation are what makes a cult destructive. If I had not personally suffered from mind control for the first part of my childhood, I would probably be a staunch defender of the rights of such groups to practice freely, unhindered by any public scrutiny. But I am extremely concerned about protecting personal liberty and defending the Constitution's guarantees of religious freedom. I fully support people's rights to believe as they choose, no matter how unorthodox their beliefs. If people want to believe that Sun Myung Moon or Charles Manson or their dog is the Messiah, then that's their right. However, and this is a crucial point, people need to be protected from processes that make them believe Manson or Moon is the Messiah. And what we will go over here is look at the different areas of society in which cults arise and the different techniques used to recruit members. How a group recruits and what happens during membership determine whether or not it respects people's rights to choose for themselves what they do and also believe. If deception, hypnosis, or other mind control techniques are used to recruit and control these followers, then people's rights are being infringed on. Now, cults are not new. Throughout history, groups of enthusiasts have sprung up around charismatic leaders of every possible description. But in recent decades, something has been added: the systematic use of modern psychological techniques to reduce a person's will and gain control over their thoughts, feelings, and behavior. While most people usually think of cults as religious, the first definition of cult in Webster's Third New International Dictionary is religious practice, worship. They are often completely secular. Webster's also defines cult as a usually small or narrow circle of persons united by devotion or allegiance to some artistic or intellectual program, tendency, or figure, as one of limited popular appeal. That second definition comes closer to the meaning of a modern cult, but still falls a bit short. Modern cults have virtually unlimited popular appeal. For the sake of brevity, from here on, I'll refer to any group in which mind control is used in destructive ways as simply a cult. In times past, cult or sect leaders could be very compelling, and abusively so. Charges of mind control against them have a long history, but until recently, leaders gained their dominance over followers in a relatively hit-or-miss kind of way, learning as they went along. Cult leadership was an art successfully practiced by relatively few. In some cases, groups that were considered cults in their earliest days are now considered to be mainline religions. Of course, even mainline religious organizations can have destructive aspects, use undue influence, or become destructive cults. Cults can arise within these major religions as well. Over the past half-century, undue influence has become more of a science. Since World War II, intelligence agencies around the world have been aggressively engaged in mind control research and development. The CIA admits to having performed drug, electroshock, and hypnosis experiments since the early 1950s under the code name MK Ultra. Research has expanded into other areas since then. 2 generations ago, the human potential movement in psychology began to experiment with techniques to direct individual and group dynamics. These techniques were developed with the best of motives to force people out of debilitating mental ruts and show them how truly different they could become. During the late 60s, a form of group therapy known as sensitivity training became popular. In this group, people were encouraged to speak about their most intimate personal matters in front of other group members. One technique widely popular at that time was called the hot seat, which was first used by the drug rehab cult Synanon. A member of the group sat in the center of the circle, while other members confronted them with what they considered to be the person's shortcomings or problems. Needless to say, without the supervision of an experienced therapist, and even sometimes with it, such a technique opens up considerable possibilities for abuse. Today, this hot seat method is used by some destructive cults to demean and control their members. Another development that began to affect the general population was the popularization of hypnosis. People were introduced to certain techniques for inducing hypnotic trance, but often without adequate consideration of the ethical aspects of working with the subconscious mind. Originally, these group process methods were used only in willing participants, and many people reported positive experiences, but soon some of the techniques percolated out into general culture, where they became available for anyone to abuse. Unscrupulous persons began using these techniques to make money and gain power by manipulating a coterie of followers. Unfortunately, with the internet, it's easy to download such information and training in these methods and to use it to manipulate and program others into new beliefs, behaviors, and in some cases even whole new identities. Because of increased media coverage, people in the U.S. began to become aware of the new cults in the middle to late 1970s. No one of this generation can forget Patty Hearst, the daughter of one of the country's most powerful newspaper publishers, William Randolph Hearst III, who transformed into Tanya, a member of Symbionese Liberation Army, which is a left-wing terrorist cult. As public awareness of the destructive potential of cult membership began to grow, we saw the birth of deprogramming. Professional deprogrammers like Ted Patrick, hired by a cult member's family or friends, would forcibly abduct the person and often in a secluded motel room tried to reverse the cult's brainwashing. Thousands of cult members, like myself, were indeed de-brainwashed successfully, and later gave some of these people give dramatic public testimony of how cult mind control worked. But many deprogrammings failed, and members in cults sometimes brought lawsuits against families and deprogrammers. And worst of all, deprogramming could be harmful to the cult member and if it were unsuccessful. Many families with members in destructive cults found abduction and forceful detention repugnant. They also found the financial burden great and the threat of lawsuits intimidating. If they didn't want to try a forcible deprogramming, they had no choice but to be patient and hope that something would happen. As a result, their family members or friends remained in cults throughout the 70s. And then something happened to change the way the whole nation perceived destructive cults, and that is the massacre at Jonestown. Above Jones' throne was affixed a sign which read, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." While no one can explain why Jones chose this saying from George Santayana as his motto, the truth in the message, ironically, is relevant to us today as we look at the history of cults and think about its modern-day implications. News of the Jonestown Massacre shocked the entire world. In the 1970s, there was little general understanding of unethical mind control or of how widespread its use had already become in society at large. In the decades following that massacre, cult groups have continued to grow unabated. New cults appear and older ones grow more sophisticated. Currently, there are groups using mind control in many different areas of society. These organizations include religious cults, political cults, psychotherapy and educational cults, as well as commercial. And there are four main types of cults. The first of which is religious cults. Those are the best known and also most numerous. These groups focus on religious dogma. Some use the Bible, the Quran. Some are based on an Eastern religion. Others draw on occult lore, and some are purely the inventions of their leaders. Although that most claim to involve the spiritual realm or to follow a strict code of religious principles, it's more common than not for these cult leaders to enjoy a luxurious lifestyle, with the groups owning millions of dollars in real estate or running extensive business enterprises. If you think of ISIS, Boko Haram, the Unification Church, Scientology, Church Universal and Triumphant, the Way International, the Organization of Osho, Scientology itself is unusual as it began as psychotherapy, as a psychotherapy cult, and it also functions as a commercial cult, but it functions under the cloak of religion, so it's very unique in that way. Second kind of cult are political cults, often make the news, usually with the word fringe or extremists attached to them. Rarely do people hear about the deceptive recruitment and mind control practices that distinguish these organizations from the normal run-of-the-mill fanatical groups. These groups are organized around a particular political dogma. One such group's leader, Lyndon LaRouche, has run for president in the past 8 elections, and claims to advise top government and business leaders. Another group, known simply as MOVE, was bombed by police in Philadelphia after holding up with an arsenal of weapons. Another, Aryan Nation, believes in white supremacy. For many years ran survivalist training camps and has plans to take over the United States or die trying. And the now defunct Democratic Workers' Party of California was for years an extreme left-wing cult. Third kind of cult is the psychotherapy and educational cults. They hold expensive workshops and seminars that provide participants with insight and enlightenment, usually in a hotel conference room. These cults use many basic mind control techniques to provide participants with a peak experience, which is to say hypnotic euphoria, although I don't think that Maslow would describe such events as peak experiences. That experience is all that happens to most customers, but others are manipulated to sign up for the more expensive advanced courses. Graduates of the advanced courses may then become enmeshed in the group. Once committed, members are told to bring in their friends, their relatives, their coworkers, or else cut off relations with them entirely. And recruiters are typically not allowed to disclose much about the program itself. Many of these kinds of groups have caused nervous breakdowns, broken marriages, business failures, suicides, accidental deaths, just reckless accidents in general. And the people who run these groups sometimes have questionable personal backgrounds, and more times than not, they have no credentials whatsoever. The last kind of main type of cult are commercial cults, and they believe in the dogma of greed. They deceive and manipulate people to work for little to no pay in the hope of getting rich. And many such pyramid scheme or multi-level marketing organizations promise huge sums of money, but in fact just totally fleece their victims. They also destroy their victims' self-esteem so they won't complain. Success depends not on selling the actual products or services, but on recruiting new people who in turn recruit others. Some of these commercial cults browbeat people into hawking magazine descriptions or other items door to door. And these kinds of cults take out ads in local newspapers. They promise exciting travel, lucrative careers, and the recruiters set up interviews inside their hotel rooms. They prey on high school and college students, and then when these people are accepted into the program, they usually have to pay money to be trained, and then they're sent far away in vans to sell merchandise. And salespeople are manipulated through fear, guilt, sometimes physically, sexually abused. These people sometimes become slaves to the company and just willingly turn over their money in order to pay for living expenses. Pimps and human traffickers run their own versions of commercial cults. And since 2013, Steve Hassan has been working with survivors of trafficking and helping them to understand how they were controlled and indoctrinated into slavery. So let's talk a little bit about recruitment and how these cults go about doing that. As we'll see, there are many different ways people can be ensnared into a relationship or group that uses mind control. Cults deliberately seek people out who are intelligent, talented, and successful. And as a result, its members are often powerfully persuasive and seductive to newcomers. The sheer number of sincere, committed numbers whom a newcomer meets is probably far more convincing than any doctrine or structure of the cult itself. And the larger cults know how to train their quote-unquote salespeople well. They indoctrinate members to show only the best sides of the organization. Members are taught to suppress any negative feelings they have about the group and to always show a continually smiling, happy face. Recruiters are taught to size up each newcomer and package and sell the cult in whatever way it's most likely to succeed to that individual person. In the Moonies, Steve Hassan was taught to use a 4-part personality model to help recruit new members. People were categorized into thinkers, feelers, doers, or believers. Thinkers are people who approach life with their minds as intellectuals. Feelers lead with their emotions. Doers are action-oriented, very physical. Believers are spiritually oriented. If a person was categorized as a thinker, Hassan would use an intellectual approach. He would show him pictures of Nobel laureates at a Mooney-sponsored science conference or philosophers discussing a variety of interesting topics. A deliberate misimpression was given that these giants of the scientific and academic communities were supporters of the movement. In fact, not one of them actually supported the Moon cause. They were interested in meeting with professional colleagues and friends, Of course, their expense-paid trips and the thousands of dollars paid to them as honorariums were added incentives. Many academics and some celebrated politicians took advantage of these paid holidays with no concern for the allure that their names were adding to an invidious cause. Feelers, on the other hand, would always respond well to a loving, caring approach. With these people, the group would accentuate the emotional well-being as well as the extended family community aspect of the group. They would always talk about love with such people and how there wasn't enough of the real kind of love in the world. And feelers automatically longed to be accepted and loved. So Hassan and recruiters would go out of their way to provide the person with a warm and enticing feeling of unconditional approval. Doers are action-oriented. They like challenges and strive to accomplish as much as they can. If they saw poverty and suffering in the world and longed to make it end, Hassan and recruiters would tell them how much that the cult, the group, was doing along these lines. Perhaps they were concerned about war or communism. They would always make it sound as though they were the only organization with a workable plan of action. Even if it was objectively untrue, the cult members would believe it was true and therefore communicate that to the potential new member. They would tell doers about hundreds of programs that they sponsored to help fix the world's problems. Believers, lastly, are people that are searching for God or looking for a spiritual meaning in their lives. They typically talk about their spiritual experiences, dreams, visions, revelations. For the most part, these people are wide open and often just ended up recruiting themselves in a way. It was always incredible, Hassan writes, to realize how many people told him that they had just been praying to God to reveal to them what he wanted them to do with their lives. Many believed they were spiritually led to meet one of the cult members. With these kinds of believer type of people, it was simply a matter of sharing testimonies and convincing them they had been led to the group by God. Contrary to public perception, most of the people that were recruited didn't fall into the believer category. Most are either feelers or doers. Many of the so-called thinkers eventually became leaders within this particular cult that Hassan was in. With this one simple personality model to guide recruiters and hundreds of front groups to operate behind, the Moon organization cast a broad recruitment net that drew in a diverse range of people. Members regard themselves as fishers of men, which is a term taken from Jesus' metaphor for describing his disciples in the New Testament. Unfortunately, decades later, the methods of mind control used by many cults are far more nuanced and sophisticated today, and potentially much more damaging. The recruiter's work is made considerably easier because most people have no idea how deep the pockets of major cults can be. Many of the larger ones have grown hugely wealthy from public fundraising techniques, by tapping their own members' bank accounts, the real estate that they own, and they reinvest a huge part of their capital into recruiting more members, which is simply a return on investment. And today, it's also quite common for some cult groups to spend huge sums of money on public relations firms and marketing specialists. They pay top dollar to these experts to help present a positive image and design recruitment campaigns. And the average person does not understand mind control. They don't know how cults operate, don't know what questions to ask, what behaviors to watch out for, and don't believe they could ever be sucked in because they think they're too smart for that. That's why so many ordinary people are prime candidates for cult recruiters. So, given that, it's interesting to see why cults have so much success. Why is there so much complacency about the threat of mind control cults? First, I guess, accepting that mind control can be effectively used on almost anybody challenges the age-old notion that human beings are rational and responsible for and in control of all their actions. This kind of worldview does not allow for any concept of mind control. Second, we all have a belief in our own invulnerability. It's too scary to think that someone could take control of our minds. We all want to have a belief in our own ability to completely control our lives. And then lastly, the processes of influence start from the moment we're born. So it's easy to take the position that everything is mind control. Why worry about it? We tell ourselves it's a normal part of life. But just as sex is a normal part of life, but seduction by a womanizer or rape is not, influence is a natural part of life, but undue influence is not. So let's dig into each of these preconceptions. First, there is the idea that a human being is inherently rational. If people operate from this viewpoint, they believe that cult members have rationally chosen to live a deviant lifestyle. If the person's an adult, the argument goes then that they have a right to live in any way they choose. That argument might be true if no deceptive or social influence techniques were used to unduly influence a person's choice. But as we know, these techniques are used. Furthermore, human beings aren't totally rational creatures. Complete rationality denies our emotional and physical nature. We can't function without our emotions. We all need love, friendship, attention, approval. Most of us agree on the wonderfulness of falling in love, for example. Most of us also understand that the condition of our bodies has a tremendous impact on the way we function psychologically. If you've ever gone a few days with little or no sleep, you've probably weren't functioning rationally and likely weren't in total control of your every action. If you've gone without food for a few days, the mind begins to hallucinate when the body doesn't have enough sleep or food. And in such circumstances, our physiology undermines our rationality. Then there is the belief in our own invulnerability. We all need to feel that we're in control of our lives. We don't like feeling that events are out of our control, so we put reality into an order that makes sense to us. When we hear that something bad has happened to someone, perhaps being mugged or raped, we usually try to find a reason to explain why that person was a victim. Was he or she walking at the wrong time? In a bad neighborhood? People try to ascribe a direct cause and effect relationship to what happened. If something bad happened to her, then she must have done something wrong. This kind of behavior is called blaming the victim. Although there is value in trying to assess possibly careless behavior, because we must learn from life's tragedies, the reality is that the person just might have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Blaming the victim plays an important psychological role in allowing us to distance ourselves from the person who was hurt. In this way, we say to ourselves, such a thing couldn't happen to me because I'm different, I know better. Often, people look at a cult victim and say mistakenly, what a weak-minded person. He must have been looking for a way to escape responsibility and have someone control his life for him. In that way, people deny the reality that the same thing could happen to them. People believe that it can't happen to them because they want to believe they're stronger and better than the many millions who have fallen victim to mind control. Our need to believe that we are invulnerable, though, is actually a weakness that is easily played upon by cult recruiters. For example, a cult recruiter could say, "Now, Joe, you strike me as very intelligent, a worldly type of person. You would never allow anyone to force you to do something you wouldn't want to do. You like to make up your mind for yourself, so you won't let the biased media scare you with bizarre claims of mind control. You're too smart for that. So what time do you want to come over for that lecture later?" As for the philosophical position mentioned earlier, that everything is a form of mind control, it's certainly true that we're constantly being influenced by all kinds of people, ideas, and forces, but there's actually a continuum of influence. At one end are benign or even helpful influences, such as a friend suggesting that the two of you see a particular movie. At the other end are deeply destructive influences, such as indoctrinating people to kill themselves or to harm others. Most of the groups that will be addressed in this series fall near the destructive end of the continuum, and we will pick up with more details on the destructive cults in the next episode of the series.